Welcome to the deep dive. Around the globe, natural hazards seem to be hitting harder and more often.
They really do. And it makes understanding how nations actually manage these risks, well, more critical than ever.
It shifted the whole conversation, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Away from just reacting after the fact.
Exactly. It's about building systems now, systems that can anticipate, mitigate, and adapt, building resilience.
Absolutely. And today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the Disaster Risk Management, or DRM, system of the Philippines.
An island nation incredibly exposed to, well, almost everything. Typhoons, floods, landslides.
Right. So we're going to explore how they're building that resilience, from the national level, the big policies, right down to specific communities on the ground.
In our analysis, it draws heavily from a detailed multi-level assessment. It's a disaster risk management systems analysis report specifically on the Philippines.
Using a specific framework.
Yeah, it uses the conceptual framework and the tools from Stephen Boss's A Guidebook. This lets us look really closely at the national government, then zoom into a province, Camarines Sur.
And even further down.
And right down to the municipal level, Minalabac in this case, so you get the full picture top to bottom.
Okay, so our mission here is basically to pull out the key insights, the real nuggets of knowledge from these sources for you.
We want to help you understand that complex interplay policy, practice, the challenges they face.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed on a really vital topic. So let's dive in. First off, what does DRM even mean in this context? It's more than just sirens and rescue boats.
Oh, definitely. It's much broader than just emergency response. Based on that Boss guidebook, DRM is really a systematic process.
Systematic how?
It uses administrative decisions, structures, skills, capacities, all aimed at putting policies and strategies into action. The core goal, to boost a society's and a community's ability to cope.
So reducing the negative impacts.
Exactly. Reducing impacts from hazards by tackling vulnerability and, crucially, building up local capacity. It's not just about cleaning up afterwards.
And for the Philippines, there was a really big turning point, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Republic Act 1121, the PDRRM Act of 2010. That sounds like it changed everything.
It was a massive shift, a real paradigm change. Before 2010, the focus was very much, rescue and recovery, pick up the pieces.
Reactive.
Completely. But the 2010 Act deliberately shifted the focus to preparedness and risk reduction. And importantly, it recognized local government units, LGUs, as the first line of defense.
Putting responsibility closer to the ground.
Precisely. And this lines up with global thinking, like the Hyogo framework for action.
Right.
Moving from reaction to proaction, preparedness, risk reduction, resilience.
Okay, so that's the philosophy shift. Who's actually leading this at the national level? Who are the main players?
Right at the top, you've got the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, the NDRMC. They're the president's main advisor on this, the top coordinator, and they hold the purse strings, basically. The highest allocator of resources.
And it's just government.
No, it's multi-sectoral. Brings together different agencies, even uses the UN cluster approach for a coordinated response in specific areas like health or food.
And who actually does the work? The implementing arm.
That's the Office of Civil Defense, the OCD. They're the secretariat for the NDRRMC, but they also lead the National Civil Defense Program, coordinate with all those LGUs, and do a lot of community education.
That sounds like a huge undertaking. It must require serious money. How is it funded?
Primarily through the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, the NDRRMF. People often just call it the Calamity Fund.
Yet it's substantial.
Very. For 2025, we're talking P21 billion allocated. That's actually up $500 million from 2024.
Wow. Where does that money go?
It's broken down. About P10.7 billion for aid, relief, rehab, and that does include some training and pre-disaster work. Then P9.3 billion for capital outlay, so reconstruction, and $1 billion for the People's Survival Fund, which is for climate adaptation projects.
Okay, so some good on paper.
But here's something interesting. As of late 2024, there was this huge available balance, almost P284 billion sitting there. They also have a separate quick response fund, the QRF, for immediate needs.
Wait, nearly 300 billion pesos unspent. That's surprising. What does that signify? Bottlenecks.
Exactly. This is where it gets really critical. That large unspent balance, while showing financial capacity is there, strongly suggests bottlenecks in implementation, problems getting projects off the ground.
And it also sounds like, despite the policy shift, a lot of the spending still happens after a disaster.
That's the other key point. The analysis suggests a larger portion still leans towards post-disaster activities rather than truly proactive prevention and mitigation.
So the prevention-first policy isn't fully translating into prevention-first spending.
It seems not consistently. It points to challenges in identifying, approving, or maybe just executing those crucial pre-disaster projects. What should be resilience funds often end up being used more like traditional relief funds.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into that national level then. Beyond NDRRMC and OCD, who else is involved institutionally?
Oh, lots of sectoral agencies have critical roles. They're meant to mainstream DRRM into their own work.
Like who?
Well, the Department of Agriculture, for instance. They have a specific DRRM section focusing on policies for farmers, using GIS, doing damage assessments, early warnings for crops and fisheries. Very important.
Makes sense. Agriculture's so vulnerable.
Hugely. The Department of Health, they've institutionalized DRM and health policies, trying to make sure hospitals and health services can withstand disasters.
And infrastructure.
That's the Department of Public Works and Highways, DPWH. They integrate DRM, and importantly, they're tasked with reviewing and revising the National Building Code.
Which you mentioned earlier.
Right. Last revised in 1977. So updating that with modern DRR measures is massive. And then you have NNEDA, the National Economic and Development Authority, leading the post-disaster recovery planning.
Okay, that sounds incredibly structured. Very detailed mandates across the board.
It is highly structured on paper.
Yeah. I sense a but coming. All those different actors. Does it actually work smoothly together? Or is it a coordination nightmare?
That's exactly the potential pitfall. Having so many players shows broad engagement, which is good, but it creates huge challenges for coordination, both horizontally getting, say, agriculture and health on the same page during a crisis.
Yeah, I can see that.
And vertically making sure the national plan actually connects with what a small town needs.
So linkages are weak points.
The Boz Guidebook specifically points this out. Complex institutional links often become weaknesses. You get overlapping roles, maybe turf wars, difficulty in unified action, even with the best intentions.
So with those coordination challenges,
Sure.
What are the main plans or instruments meant to guide everyone? What's the playbook?
The main one is the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, the NDRMP. It's a detailed roadmap, really detailed. We're talking 14 objectives, 24 outcomes, 56 outputs, 93 activities by 2028.
Wow.
And a core idea is mainstreaming DRRM and also climate change adaptation, CCA, into everything else. The big national plans like the Philippine Development Plan, the Climate Change Action Plan, National Security Policy, across all sectors, environment, farming, health, land use.
The intention is clearly there to embed this thinking everywhere.
Very strong policy intent.
But then we come back to something like the National Building Code. If the policy is strong, why the lag in updating such a critical regulation? Still stuck in 1977. That feels like a major disconnect.
It really highlights the gap, doesn't it, between strong policy intent and the sometimes slow pace of updating and, crucially, enforcing regulations on the ground.
So mainstreaming isn't just about writing it into plans.
Not at all. It requires consistent enforcement, continuous capacity building, political will to push past inertia, and making sure standards are actually updated and used. It's the follow-through that's hard.
Okay, on a more positive tech front, the source mentioned using innovation. What tools are they deploying?
Yeah, there's a commitment there. They use systems like PhilAware, which the OCD uses. It gives multi-hazard situational awareness, a clearer picture for decision makers during an event.
Real-time info.
Exactly. And JORRisk PH for science-based planning, risk mapping. These are powerful tools for assessment and early warning.
But is everyone using them?
Well, that's the potential issue, the data divide. If these advanced systems aren't effectively cascaded down and actually used by the provinces and municipalities, then the benefits don't fully reach the front lines where they're needed most.
Right. Okay, let's make that transition now. From the national level down to a specific province. Camarines Sur. Can you paint a picture of the situation there? What are the main hazards?
Camarines Sur, it's in the Baikal region, and it's really in the firing line. They average about 20 tropical cyclones a year passing through their area.
20? That's relentless.
It is. Causes huge damage, especially to agriculture and fisheries, which are vital there. But it's not just typhoons. They face severe floods, especially along the Baikal River Basin, plus droughts in some areas and landslides in the hillier parts. It's a multi-hazard environment.
And the people living there. How does this constant threat intersect with their lives, their vulnerabilities.
The vulnerability is deeply intertwined with socioeconomic factors. Agricultural production, rice, corn, livestock, fishing, it's all acutely exposed.
And certain groups are hit harder.
Definitely. The analysis points to specific vulnerable groups. Households headed by the elderly or women, large families, people living right on the seashore or riverbanks, fishermen, widows, those in deep poverty, informal settlers.
Why them particularly?
They often have very few assets to begin with and limited capacity to cope when disaster strikes, let alone recover afterwards. They're easily pushed over the edge by repeated shocks.
That combination, multiple hazards, deep-seated vulnerability, it screams for an integrated approach, doesn't it? Multi-hazard, multi-sectoral.
Absolutely. You can't just focus on typhoons when floods and landslides are also major risks.
And how are communities coping right now? The report mentioned something about farmers' adaptation.
Yes, it noted that farmers' adaptation measures are often reactive rather than proactive.
Meaning they act after the damage is done.
Largely, yes, and also autonomous rather than well-planned. So individual efforts may be admirable in their own right, but not part of a larger systematic strategy supported by the province.
That shows a gap, then, between community coping and planned interventions.
A significant gap. It highlights the need to better connect that grassroots resilience with more strategic, provincial-level support to build real, long-term adaptation.
So how is the provincial institution, the PDRMO, Provincial Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, set up to tackle this? What are its capabilities?
The PDRRMO is the executive arm of the Provincial Council, the PDRRMC. It has a really broad mandate, coordinating programs, doing research and planning, training people, operating early warning systems, monitoring.
A lot on their plate.
A huge amount. And remember, RA 10121 calls LGUs like this the frontliners, which is correct.
But can they actually do all that effectively, especially in a place like Cameroon-Sur with such high exposure?
That's the core issue. Their operational effectiveness really boils down to actual capacity. Do they have enough staff, the right technical skills, specialized equipment, enough funding? Given the scale of the challenge in Camp Sur, there's often a mismatch between that wide mandate and the resources available to fulfill it.
Which brings us to resources. Did Cameroon-Sur get significant funding?
They did receive a good chunk from the local government support fund, about P512 million back in FY 2021. That was for rehabilitation and reconstruction, shelter, infrastructure, agriculture, etc. Plus, they have access to that quick response fund.
$500 million pesos sounds like a lot.
It is substantial.
But again, is it enabling proactive work? Or is it mostly going towards fixing things after they break? What does it mean for long-term resilience?
That remains the key question, is the funding flexible enough? Is it strategically allocated towards pre-disaster prevention and mitigation? Or does it stay predominantly reactive?
So the shift hasn't fully happened in practice.
Achieving that long-term resilience really requires a strategic shift in how provincial budgets are allocated. More focus on pre-disaster investments, maybe fostering local innovation, moving beyond just rebuilding the same vulnerable structures over and over.
Okay, national, provincial. Now let's get right down to the sharp end. The municipality of Minalabac within Cameroon-Sur. What's the hazard profile there? Is it even more intense?
It's incredibly acute in Minalabac. Flood susceptibility is extreme. 24 out of its 25 barangays, or villages, are prone, and floods can last for days, like 4 to 5 days after Super Typhoon Ulysses in 2020.
Almost the entire municipality underwater for days.
Pretty much. Then you have rain-induced landslides in 13 of the hillier barangays. Storm surges hitting 4 coastal barangays, and that's getting worse with sea level rise. Plus, liquefaction risk, where the ground behaves like liquid during earthquakes in 22 barangays if a quake over magnitude 5 hits.
It's hard to even imagine dealing with that density of risk.
Yeah.
And the frequency.
That's the other thing. It's not theoretical. Between 2019 and 2023 alone, just a 4-year window, they were hit by 7 typhoons, 2 earthquakes, and 2 landslide incidents, all causing extensive damage.
7 typhoons in 4 years.
Yeah. And this intense hazard profile meets really deep vulnerability. 88% of the population lives in those flood-prone areas. You've got informal settlers, flimsy housing.
Same vulnerable groups we saw at the provincial level.
Yes, the elderly, young children, those in poverty. Livelihoods are also fragile. Nearly 20% depend on agriculture, which is constantly hit by climate shocks, trapping people in poverty.
And the source mentioned something really striking about insurance in Minalabac.
Yes, this is critical. There's a complete absence of property insurance coverage. For homes, for businesses, nothing.
So when disaster strikes,
Individuals and the LGU itself bear the entire financial burden of rebuilding or replacing lost assets. There's no safety net from insurance.
And critical infrastructure, schools, roads.
Also highly exposed and vulnerable. Key facilities, lifeline utilities, they're right in the path of these hazards too.
It really sounds like a devastating cycle. Frequent hazards hitting vulnerable people and infrastructure, maybe before they've even recovered from the last one.
That's exactly the situation Minalabac faces. A challenging, relentless cycle of impact, partial recovery, then another impact. It makes building sustained, long-term resilience incredibly difficult.
So, faced with that, how does the municipal DRRM office, the MDRRMO, function? What can they actually do on the ground?
Well, the MDRRMO operates under the same national law, RA 10121. Their job is to implement the municipal DRRM plan.
What services do they provide?
Frontline stuff. They have 247 search and rescue teams, SAR and retrieval teams. They conduct first aid and basic life support training. They disseminate information materials, warnings. They provide equipment and vehicle assistance where they can.
And they try to plan ahead.
Yes, there's a commitment to data-driven planning. They use risk assessments, local risk maps, the Climate and Disaster Risk Assessment, CDRA, comprehensive land use plans, CLUP, all feeding into their municipal plan.
Do they involve the community directly?
They do. Community-based DRM, or CBDRRM, is key. They run community drills, awareness campaigns, and partner with local CSOs and NGOs. There's definitely effort at that local level.
Now, you mentioned transparency earlier. Minalabac posted its fund utilization reports online. That sounds positive, right? Shows accountability.
It is a positive step, yes. Posting those local disaster risk reduction and management fund utilization reports publicly shows transparency in how funds are supposedly being used. Well, here's the catch. While Minalabac does this, broader national audit reports looking at LGU DRM funds across the country often highlight systemic problems.
Such as?
Things like unsupported disbursements, not following procurement rules, unimplemented programs, even understaffed disaster management offices.
So the transparency report might not tell the whole story about effectiveness.
Exactly. It suggests there can be a gap between reporting what you plan to spend or did spend and how effectively and efficiently those funds are actually used on the ground to reduce risk.
And what about their physical stuff? Yeah. The boats, the trucks, the supplies. Do they have enough?
LGUs are encouraged by the national framework to buy response equipment boats, vehicles, communication gear, protective equipment, and to stockpile supplies like food, water, hygiene kits.
But does Minalabac have it all?
The specific inventory for Minalabac isn't provided in the source, but it does note that LGUs often need to borrow heavy equipment from neighboring LGUs or the province.
Which implies?
It implies limits to their self-sufficiency. If you have to wait to borrow a bulldozer or a rescue boat during a crisis, that can critically delay your response. It shows potential gaps in their immediate operational capacity.
Okay, so we've seen the national picture, the provincial pressures, the acute municipal challenges. Let's try to tie it all together. How do these different levels actually link up, vertically and horizontally?
Well, vertically, the system is designed for linkage. RA 10121 aims to build capacity from the top down. The OCD coordinates with LGUs. Regional DRRMCs endorse provincial plans. National agencies like agriculture or health cascade their policies downwards.
That's the top-down flow. What about bottom-up? Does local experience inform national policy?
Implicitly, yes. Local DRRM offices create their plans, which should reflect local needs. But the BOSS guidebook cautions that this bottom-up feedback loop is often the weakest link in centralized systems like this.
So local knowledge might not always make it back up effectively.
It can struggle to. Getting those ground truths to genuinely influence national strategy is often a challenge.
And horizontally, across different sectors, different stakeholders.
Again, the structure is there. The NDRMC itself is multi-agency. The Department of Health works across sectors. But genuine, effective day-to-day coordination between different national ministries or between national and local sectoral offices can still be weak despite the formal structures. That too many cooks issue again.
So the bottom line for the system's overall resilience.
It really hinges on how seamlessly information flows, how efficiently resources are channeled, and how well joint decisions are made across all those levels, national, provincial, municipal, and between different sectors. Gaps anywhere in that chain lead to fragmented efforts, maybe delays, and a disconnect between the plan and the reality.
Let's talk about mainstreaming DRRM into development planning again. We know the national policy commitment is strong, aligning the NDRMP with the big development plans. How does that play out lower down?
At the provincial and municipal levels, you have instruments like the Provincial Development and Physical Framework Plan, PDPFP, the Municipal DRRM Plan, MDRMP, the Climate and Disaster Risk Assessments, CDRA, the Comprehensive Land Use Plans, CLUP. All of these are intended to integrate DRRM.
And they're using science.
They are encouraged to, using tools like JorisPH, PlanSmart, landslide susceptibility mapping, feeding that science into the land use and disaster plans.
The framework seems solid, but you said earlier true mainstreaming is more than just plans. It needs a shift in budgeting, investments, actual practices.
Exactly. It's about changing how things are fundamentally done.
So what's needed to make that real shift happen?
It really demands continuous capacity building, making sure people at all levels have the skills. Sustained political will leaders have to champion this and push through resistance or inertia. And robust accountability, making sure the integration actually happens and leads to results.
So it's about embedding DRRM into the DNA of development.
Precisely. Making resilient infrastructure, climate-adaptive agriculture, risk-informed land use the default, not an afterthought or a separate checklist item.
Finally, stepping back, how does the Philippines measure up overall against something like the Hyogo Framework for Action's priorities? Have they achieved that culture of safety?
The analysis suggests significant progress. They're definitely beyond basic awareness. In some areas, you could argue they have coherent and integrated systems reaching level 4, perhaps?
So the policy foundations are strong.
Very strong. And there are definitely pockets of excellence, specific communities, specific agencies that have built impressive resilience.
But not universally.
Not yet. Those persistent challenges we discussed, coordination issues, fund utilization efficiency problems, local adaptation often remaining reactive, they indicate that a full culture of safety, maybe HFA's level 5, isn't yet embedded everywhere.
So a work in progress.
I think that's fair. The Philippines is likely in a crucial transition phase. Strong foundations are laid, but they're still grappling with the complexities of making it all work consistently and effectively, especially bridging that gap between national intent and local action, the last mile challenge.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We've really unpacked the layers of the Philippines' DRM system, a strong, ambitious national framework.
Right. Met by the harsh reality of high exposure at the provincial level, like in Camarines, sir.
And then down to the municipal front line in Minalabac, committed efforts, but facing overwhelming vulnerability and resource constraints.
And that common thread running through it all is the challenge of translation. Translating good policy intent into consistent, effective action and seamless coordination across every level.
So, based on this analysis, what are the key strategic takeaways? What needs to happen next?
The analysis points to 5 key areas, really. First, strengthening that interagency coordination, making it truly functional. Second, optimizing fund use, shifting more towards proactive pre-disaster investment. Third, enhancing local capacities, giving those PDRMOs and MDRMOs the tools and resources they need. Fourth, deepening the mainstreaming of DRMM into all development. And fifth, really empowering communities through genuine bottom-up planning, making sure their voices and knowledge shape the strategies.
Strengthening coordination, proactive funding, local capacity, deeper mainstreaming, and community empowerment. Makes sense.
A holistic approach.
So a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Considering all this, how might you, as an individual, or maybe as part of your own community, contribute to or advocate for these kinds of critical shifts?
Yeah, if disaster risk management really is this continuous cycle of learning and adapting.
What role do our individual actions, our community efforts, play in turning policy ambitions into real, tangible resilience on the ground? Something to think about. Thank you for diving deep with us today.